This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist John Gerrard. The Irish-born artist has spent more than 20 years using the latest in technology to create virtual worlds. Unlike video art, Gerrard's work is generated from a handwritten computer program while viewing, and no two viewing experiences are ever the same. The content of his work typically asks the viewer to deeply consider the attributes and consequences of the environment they are viewing. And now, a discussion about the generation of virtual worlds with John Gerrard. So, John Gerrard, thank you for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. John, I usually like to start conversations with the artists with a hypothetical, which is if you were at a dinner party seated next to somebody who has no idea who you are or what you do, how do you describe that to them?
That's a good place to start because that actually happens quite frequently. So I would typically say, just to try and sort of couch it in something that people might understand, I typically say that as an artist, I make virtual worlds. And then, the inevitable next question is, do I make games? Do I make sort of virtual games? And I say no, like they're more kind of like they're sort of more static, kind of, let's say, like the specific scenes which I find interesting or sort of important. And I typically build a portrait of that scene within the virtual, and then present it in the world as an artwork. So, but often I'll go through all of that, and then people still have no idea what I'm talking about, to be frank. So. One thing I try and really communicate to people is that I'm not making films. That these are not worlds that are like tied to a timeline. There's no specific narrative. It's a kind of world making. In a sense, like it's a little bit sculpture on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also kind of painterly because they're sort of scenes. But nonetheless, it's a fairly difficult thing to communicate.
We may spend half the program just kind of trying to define what your work is and isn't, right? It's not static, it's not video, but there's a moving visual element to your work, but it isn't tied to the timeline that we typically think of in terms of film, correct?
Yeah. I mean, really, the kind of the platform that I'm jumping from is called the game engine, basically. And really, the game engine is best understood or described as like a virtual world, and the engine controls the camera in that world. So, the camera is in the world recording what's happening within that virtual world. And by that, I mean, in real time, it's calculating lighting, shadowing, dynamics like smoke or these kinds of things, and it's sending that stream of images out to a display device, be it a screen, be it an LED, be it a projector. And what's interesting for me is that that stream, with a good graphics card and a good engine, you can get 60, 80, 100 frames per second coming out of the engine. And each of those frames are displayed for a fraction of a second for the public, and then they're discarded, basically. So really the cultural artifact of what I'm producing is like a piece of software, like code, on the one hand. And on the other hand, potentially it's just like people's memory of these moments in time. Those are that's the kind of pivot of the presentation in a way. Because at the end of the presentation, there's no real thing. There's a set of instructions to produce an image which has the presence, has a world-like quality, I would say.
That's really interesting because, that creates a real ephemeral nature to your work in that as things are being created, things are being dumped. Can I assume that if I were to walk into one of your installations, say I were to take an image of a work, at some point in time in its generation, can I assume that I will never exactly see that same moment again, or like no two moments are the same over the course of the installation?
Like in effect, a little bit depends on the piece, but these are like I don't necessarily have to do this, but I place the worlds that I make into an annual, let's say, orbit of light. So, sun rises on my world, specific to where the piece is located, not where it's been exhibited, but let's say it's a portrait of the ocean near Tonga. The sun will rise on that scene on Tongan time, and it'll rise in a certain position in June, a different position in January, travel over the sky. So, I mean, it's quite minimal, but, obviously the sun will be in a different position each day unless you're there at the same time next year. So that's like the first layer of kind of difference, So these are annual solar sins. In the case of, let's say, a flag work, such as a piece called Flare, which was just at Pace over the summer. That piece centers on like a burn simulation, like a fuel burn simulation, which is, which just unfolds. I mean, it's largely like there's parameters within which it unfolds. So, it has a recognizable quality across its cycles. But it's not a loop, like it doesn't repeat itself. Like it's a sort of simulation of the burning of a kind of dirty gas in a way. So each time you see it, the sun will probably be in a different position, a slightly different burn, the waves will be in a slightly different condition. But that's not the point of the work. But what you've said is true. It's unlikely, it's actually impossible you'll see the same scene twice.
That exhibit, Inlings, at Pace over the summer, I was in New York. I was on a panel at NFT NYC, and I made it down to Chelsea. When I got to Pace, the gallery was actually closed and installing your work. And so through the window, I could see them installing Flare, and I was so kind of taken back by the scale of it that I was taking video through the window. Can you tell us a little bit more about Inlings? And that's an exhibit that was at Pace over the summer that was comprised by 3 works, right?
Yeah. So I suppose first of all, Pace has 2 spaces on West 25th. One is the new sort of tower, let's say, of kind of multiple galleries, and the historic Pace Gallery, which is at 508, 510, just under the High Line, which is like a really very substantial lateral gallery stretching back, stretching to the side. Actually goes under the High Line. With these amazing glass doors which open onto the street. On cooler days, you could open it onto the street. So Endling, the show that you're describing, opened there in June 2022. And, I'm not exactly sure how big the space is, but it's about like 1,000 square meters. Like it's a really big.
It's enormous, and they spent a huge sum of money to make that an open space with no pillars. I mean, it's massive.
Yeah. So that would have happened a while ago, but and it's also got these incredible histories. I mean, Robert Irwin did the most beautiful perspex pillar show there. Smithson did this amazing, sort of sculptural, minimal sculptural shows there. So there's all these kind of histories there. Terrell, all these incredible artists. So my show centered on 3 works, as you mentioned. The first, when you came in, was an 18-foot by 18-foot LED from this incredible company called Row Visual that actually supported the installation. And so it's a big LED that's the size of like a 2-story building, basically. And on it is a work called Flare, which is a flag which is constructed out of, let's say it's like a gas flare, sort of an alarm on the one hand, and a sort of and a kind of a flag on the other, located in the sea near a portrait of the sea near Tonga. Behind that, at the back of the gallery, behind the wall, the big LED wall, you have another smaller LED wall, which is about 2 meters by 2 meters, mounted on the wall. And that was showing a piece called Washington.stream. That's a response to the 405 in LA on Thanksgiving evening, where you've got like these two streams of traffic, headlights making one stream, taillights making the other, one red, one white, replicated to become a kind of 30,000 car traffic simulation. And in that piece, there's this sort of performance of a flag, this kind of flag-like performance. Again, set on LA time with the camera orbiting around. So you kind of lose the flag qualities at a certain point and it comes back around. And the whole show was titled by the last work, which was in the side gallery, which is a portrait of the very last of the American passenger pigeons. And, it's funny, I was overhearing somebody in the gallery in July when I was there. Somebody was doing a tour and they were talking about like carrier pigeons. Like carrier pigeons are different than passenger pigeons. Carrier pigeons like carry messengers around.
Right.
Passenger pigeons were never really tamed as such. They were these extraordinary community, like population of wild American pigeons, passenger pigeons. Between 8 to 10 billion of them lived, traveling down the east coast of America, mostly feeding from the woods, like nuts from the woods. It's called mast. Round about, let's say 1800, maybe between 8 to 10 billion of those birds. And in 1900, you had one. So It's this kind of absolutely incredible population collapse, one known example. And that known example was a bird called Martha, who's christened Martha, who lived out her last days in Cincinnati Zoo. And so she died in 1914 as kind of a celebrity, like the last of the passenger pigeons. Nobody could ever imagine that the passenger pigeons would become extinct because there were so many of them. And there's lots of reasons why they became extinct, but mostly to do with excessive, human consumption of them and also disruption of their nesting sites and these sort of things. So the final piece is a kind of melancholy, small simulation showed on an LCD, which was called Endling, which is a monochromatic black and white portrait of Martha in her cage. And we built that portrait around photographs from Cincinnati Zoo on the one hand, but also documentation of the taxidermied body of Martha, which is in the Smithsonian in Washington, basically. So, and mostly what she does is she kind of keeps an eye on you as an endling. She keeps an eye on you, kind of the contemporary public.
So I've heard you describe your work as being anxious objects that shift people. Can you maybe give a little bit more insight as to what's behind that description?
I was probably feeling a little bit overconfident that day because they're anxious objects for sure, in a way, are unfamiliar objects in a way, and their ambition is to I suppose move people, to kind of move the public in different sorts of ways. And I guess like within the specific language that's developed, within the work, the worlds are very realistic, but they're also fundamentally virtual, and that is often like a start point in a public relationship with the work, which is that it's recognizably real, but there's something that's a little bit the matter, something slightly kind of wrong, and people don't entirely know exactly where or what. So that's a sort of slightly uncomfortable, maybe anxious place to begin, which is like what is it that I'm addressing, and also like it doesn't have many of those game qualities of kind of like certain kinds of resolution, certain types of pace, certain types of even aesthetics. It doesn't have that. It has another sort of aesthetic. And then I suppose the subject of the work, as I described, Endling, Flare, they sort of respond to, I would describe it, as contemporary conditions, which are like increasingly anxious, where, Flare is recontextualized by Russia switching off natural gas to flowing to Europe yesterday. with no schedule around, it starting again. So, these are sort of anxious times. And I think in a sense, like I've always been interested in these places where, power intersects with energy. Power means, both like energy on the one hand, and it also, has a connotation of like force and politics and such things. So like that pivot of kind of, simulation, power, energy, I suppose politics, the work is relatively political, so those are sort of start points.
Sure.
And then again, like the hope is that the public will come to them, and the greatest ambition of any artist is to move the public,
Sure.
As opposed to just being ignored, which is also possible.
No, I find it really interesting that you're able to get to these places where just the words that we assign the work is able to exist at so many levels, right? So like the Inling piece, the flare, there's a term in natural gas or in gas production where you're burning off excess, and that's called flaring. But think, and when we think of if you're out in the ocean, like this flag in the Tongan Ocean is, if you were to send up a distress signal, that would also be a flare, right?
Yeah, that dual meaning to the word flare is absolutely the center of that piece. I mean, rewinding a tiny little bit, I have another work called Western Flag, which is a portrait of the site of the first big oil strike in world history, which happened in Spindletop in Texas in 1901, where it was like the first like mega strike, let's say the birth of big oil, a place called Spindletop. And I showed the resulting work, which is a portrait of that site augmented by kind of almost like a carbon flag, like a smoke flag. I showed it in Madrid, late 2019. And I was approached by an artist and activist from Tonga called Uli Lucy. And he said to me, he sort of acknowledged that it's interesting to speak about the histories of oil exploitation, which is what that piece addresses. And also what's called the carbon legacy, which is how CO2 from those early strikes are still in the atmosphere, which is sort of fascinating and not very well known. But what he specifically said to me at that time was that as a Tongan, as an artist, as a swimmer, as a sort of activist, he said he just wanted to announce to like the public in Madrid that the ocean is on fire. And he said that to me there in Madrid at the climate change conference in Madrid in late 19. And I was just really struck by this idea that for him, what he means by that is that the ocean is getting hot, and by on fire, he means that like just it's, you have these like the equivalent to kind of wildfires, like, passing across, heat waves passing through the ocean, let's say in Tonga, and they leave behind kind of marine deserts, they kind of kill off all the corals and such things. And so I went away and kind of thought about this idea, a piece of language, which is that the ocean is on fire. And in time, developed a response, which was this idea of the flare, the alarm, the language of flames. And also, really, Uli's appeal was also for the viability of Tonga, as a nation state, that is Tonga going to survive these disasters and catastrophes that keep kind of like assaulting it, particularly climate related. So, the flare is both, as you said, like an alarm, but it is also a national flag, which is kind of in a way self-combusting, or, it's not on fire, like it actually is fire. That's the material. It's built from flames.
So can you talk about the role of time in your work? You spoke about the orbits. There are several things going on. A lot of times the virtual camera moves through your work at the pace that someone walks. Light changes according to where the object is in the natural world. But then you have other works where, for example, the 3,000-year sunrise, right? I mean, how do you deal with time in your work?
It's funny, I was kind of mentioned. So actually, it's a piece called Thousand Year Dawn. So it's 1,000 years, not 3,000 years.
I'm sorry.
And no problem, no problem. And that's really the one of the very, very first works. That's from 2005. And when I moved out of, let's say, like 3D scanning in like the mid to late 90s, I was not moved out of, but I was scanning things in like the mid 90s.
Mhm.
And I was kind of saying to myself, here is a kind of a photographic type record of the world, but it's a kind of three-dimensional record. It's a photo type record. And at that time, I called them image objects. They're kind of images and objects simultaneously, which is really what they are, actually. Like a digital 3D scan is like an image object. It's a photographic type thing that you can turn. And as the 90s came to a close, um, people started talking to me about game engines. Why don't you
Mhm.
bring these things into game engine? I was like, I came from an art school background, and art schools, were very disconnected from computing at that time. I mean, they still kind of are, but like even more so then. So the moment I got into the engine with this scan, this head actually, it just became very clear to me that like time, let's say the temporal aspect of this space was a sort of sculptural component of it. You could work with time in these absolutely new, there was no precedent to it. And so one of the very first pieces, which was not a scan, because the engines at that time, the graphics at that time, they just couldn't really deal with the sort of resolutions coming from scanning, is a piece called Thousand Year Dawn, where you have a virtual beach, a virtual sea, a virtual sun. A young man is standing, a portrait of somebody I knew at that time called Marcel is standing on the beach, and he's watching the sun rise in the piece, basically. So the sun is rising. Everything else is running at the normal tempo, like the waves are moving up the beach and he's breathing and shifting his position. But the sun is rising in that work very, very, very slowly. So it's rising so that it'll break free of the horizon in 3005. So it's like 1,000 year dawn. And we programmed the work, in the unlikely situation that it actually gets to that point, so that he would leave the scene in 3005 and you would end up just with the dawn, basically. That would be the work. And so we presented that actually in Miami at an art fair in 2005. And it was the first work I ever sold. People came in, collectors came in and bought it. And it just was this kind of radical shift in how I could work, and just to be clear, it was presented as as a piece of software
Mhm.
on a computer in an artist's frame. But really the collectors were acquiring art software, an edition of, I think, 5. And then, over time, a lot of those collectors have had to come back, like 2005, what's that, like 17 years ago, and they've had to upgrade elements of the installation. So but it's really the software that is the kind of core thing that they acquire. But just to get back to where we started, so that was an early work which really addressed this idea of time as a sculptural element of the virtual. And a little later, I made a piece called Oil Stick Work, where there's a kind of piece of work that's accumulating in the scene over 30 years. But I've really not really dealt with this idea of time so explicitly since then, since '05. But we're currently developing an NFT project, like a spatial NFT, temporal NFT project, where we kind of get back to that idea of duration and accumulation. So that's what we're working on now.
So is that a piece that would be more generative, where things are manifested over time, that they evolve and change? And
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's still in the development stage, but there's a character in the work, that's arranging objects in these kind of unique ways over time, like three-dimensional objects, like let's say bones, kind of arranging bones in different sorts of ways. And it's a kind of like a human-like character in a way, like not quite a human character. So each iteration of this piece, you have this kind of different sort of unfolding work within it over time. And I must say that category of like NFTs and world making is very, very underdeveloped right now. It intersects with what's called WebGL, like web graphics language. And my piece, which I did for Art Blocks, which is called Petra National, which opened around simultaneously to actually NFT Art Week in New York and my show in New York. It opened just a few days before. They're actually temporal NFTs, like they're annual work. So the sun comes up and goes down in those over a year. But that didn't really register with people. I mean, what registered is that like each work is a portrait of a country realized as a gasoline spill. And, some of the more basic aspects of those works kind of registered, but that temporal aspect didn't. So that there's more work to be done there, sure. Which is interesting.
So the game engine versus WebGL, how much power is in the WebGL? Like, can you do the things in WebGL that you were able to do, 15 years ago, but kind of self-contained in an NFT?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I cannot do the kind of things I'm doing in contemporary engines hooked up to kind of super graphics cards now. I can't do some of those things, particularly, let's say, the multi-actor works, where you've got like 10,000 elements within the work, that kind of stuff. That's not going to happen. But, what's interesting is that I didn't really have a mechanism, because like historically, if I was going to make a virtual world, like a simulation, like it's quite a big undertaking. And we have an amazing producer here, Werner Pritzelberger, an incredible programmer who I worked with for many years, Hamid Bressler. But also typically you'd work with a group of modelers, group of animators, et cetera, So they become quite big productions, and then, they move into the world, let's say, via geographic system. Let's say a gallery brings one, to a show in their gallery or potentially to an art fair, in Switzerland or something. But that's all kind of like quite a heavy structure in a way. And what's incredibly rich and sort of exciting about the NFT infrastructure is that it's non-geographic. Your collectors are global, your exhibition space is online. And so we're like lightening up, like we're like making a couple of works right now within the NFT space, which are almost like drawings. I never really could do that, because like, how would you bring like a drawing type sim into this very heavy geographic gallery world, like you can put a drawing on the wall, but I don't really do that. I've always been like very, very digitally kind of native, like right back to when I kicked off in art school as I said, in the mid 90s. So just to try and answer your question a bit more clearly, I could make Thousand Year Dawn in WebGL now, no problem. Absolutely. Yeah. But we're going to try and push that a little bit, I would say it'll probably be best viewed on a laptop, like less so than on let's say a handheld. It'll probably be seen on the handheld, but the frame rate might be a little bit under pressure. But yeah, I mean, we can, from what we were doing in 2005, we can do effortlessly. We can not effortlessly, but we can absolutely deliver that into WebGL. And that's, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, like this is the most exciting part of NFTs right now, post MP4, post JPEG, to a degree, almost like radically cranking open that generative space, sure. As opposed to the generative, like on-chain script delivering like a two-dimensional output, generative on-chain delivering like three-dimensional spatial temporal worlds.
I have a question that applies to both, I guess, the NFT space and in the gallery site-specific work, and that is navigation. In this NFT work, are you allowing the viewer a sense of autonomy to navigate around this object? And I know that traditionally in your work, there's sort of a set path, right? I mean, things will change, but that virtual camera is
it's pretty fixed, yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny you say that, because Thousand Year Dawn, when it was exhibited, was on a shelf with a laptop in the shelf, a little turn sensor, and a pivot, and you could look around the world by turning the screen. That's how it was first presented. So the original works, the public could look around the world. And for those who were kind of raised on cinema, let's say, like that was like, I remember people like being totally shocked that they could physically look around something. And that's obviously changed over time. But, pertinent to what you've just said, over time, we dropped that interactivity. They became virtual scenes with this very formal camera that walks around the work. You've got an orbit of a camera at walking speed, as you've described, set in a light orbit of a year. And then often other kind of orbits, be it the burn cycle or these kinds of things, which are embedded. And, I suppose on a podcast like this, it's worthwhile pointing out that like an orbit is, a self-similar cycle, but upon which different things can happen. And a loop is, where the same thing happens over and over and over again. So, the world of real time and the virtual is very orbital. It's suited to orbital languages. The world of cinema and video is suited to kind of loop type languages, and they're really different. And I hit that absolutely head on with a very early NFT of mine called Western Flag NFT, which had to be a 30-second loop. Which was like first time I had worked in any kind of video language in like 25 years. So it was a bit of a shock to the system, but in terms of interactivity, if you look at Petronational on Art Blocks, which is a collaboration between Art Blocks and Pace Gallery, if you either with your finger or with your mouse, if you click on each of those 196 NFTs, you can look around the world, within a fairly set orbit, and you can tip it a little bit to look around it in different sorts of ways. So interactivity has come right back in with the emergence of the spatial temporal NFT, because I've always been interested that the public would understand that this is a kind of three-dimensional world, that it's not like a two-dimensional surface, that you can pivot around it.
What do you consider the finished work? I mean, is it the code or is it the installation of the work? Do the pieces that are more site-specific change that answer? I've heard you speak about how some of the pieces, it's very specific how it's installed and how it's perceived, because it's almost creating, I don't want to say a virtual experience, but you're creating like a synthetic live experience within a space, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, so a couple of kind of layers to that question. I mean, first of all, the work is the executed code. Like let's say the cultural artifact, like if a museum was to acquire the work, they would acquire the software, which is a kind of like a packaged bundle of different types of libraries and code and such things. But the work is the executed code, so it's sort of like if the machine's not in the mix, if the computer's not in the mix, you really don't have the work, So the piece is kind of in that light, kind of weirdly robust, but also quite sort of vulnerable in a weird way. So that said, the works are typically very site specific, within the context of where and how they are executed. So, and this makes my life kind of really, pretty challenging, ongoing. For instance, like the show and pace, each element was scaled to its site, so I come from a sculptural background. I also come from a background where, I've paid very, very close attention to artists like, as I said, Robert Irwin or, James Turrell or such people, or even Ronnie Horn would be another big influence for me, even artists like Felix Gonzalez Torres was a very, very big influence on me when I was kind of coming up as an artist. So I would look at the negative space like around these proposed interventions, and that would be kind of very key, that sort of negative space.
Right.
Then like how the installation is resolved, like how the LED wall sits in the world, what sits underneath it, how it's supported. They're always frameless. You have the real and the virtual up against each other. The very earliest installations along these lines really kicked off, as I described, like, let's say around '05, so we're sort of like 17, 18 years into this language of kind of very formal installations of simulations in physical space. And also now increasingly on the street, with LEDs, but again, paying a lot of attention to the negative space around the works.
Mm-hmm.
But like really each installation is deeply site specific. And by that, I mean, LEDs are incredibly luminous, like they're light emitting diodes. And, it's almost as if like if you're trying to set up like a sound installation, it has to be tuned to the setting,
Mm-hmm.
Is that very similar to LEDs, like it has to actually be dialed to the setting so that like you look at the floors and the walls and all those things. Also, like these are annual simulations, so the sun goes down, it gets dark. What does that mean for the work? Like part of me kind of wonders, like, how do you communicate all this stuff, like to institutions, and how do you kind of try and get the work kind of installed in an exemplary kind of fashion into the future? So it's pretty difficult, actually, but again, my undergraduate, I come from a really like a sculptural background, and another artist who's been incredibly influential on me would be the French artist Pierre Huyghe. Mm-hmm. And, his version of sort of site specificity is even more expanded than mine, because like, he has all these layers, which he's paying a lot of attention to do with kind of like what's growing there. And, he's kind of quite often working out in the landscape. I don't know. Yeah. So
I feel like as these LEDs have, this is a capability that wasn't there for you 15, 20 years ago, right? And as the capability is now there to actually create and install basically a digital monolith in a landscape that an artist may want to capture just for the sense of sublime as a landscape photographer or painter, putting this digital monolith there in conversation with its surroundings, it seems like it really creates a whole other world that's also changing. Which, you mentioned James Turrell earlier. As the light starts changing on some of these environments, at the same time that your work is changing, in its orbit, in its light. There's this serendipity that kind of occurs, right? I mean, there's a little magic there, right?
Have you ever seen, I was part of, there's a beautiful project in California called Desert X.
I saw images of that.
Which is out like in the desert near Palm Springs. It's like a biennale. And I'm just going to quickly share. Can I share my screen here?
Yeah.
I know it's a podcast, but I can share my screen quickly. 1 second. So basically that is an LED in the desert near Palm Springs. And exactly as you have said, this is a world in a world,
Right.
I'm just trying to find one other.
What's really interesting about the image that you just showed is that it really feels like the sky I know it's a photograph, but it really seems like the sky in your image, in your work, is at a point where it's matching the sky above that mountain line.
The funny thing is they're not that far away from each other, And
it's almost like it's cut a hole in reality, right?
Well, that's a word that I often use. I mean, that image that I'm now sharing, which is like a little bit later in the day, like when I'm trying to describe to institutions what I'm trying to do, often use the word I'm trying to cut a hole in the reel and to produce this sense of an overlay or underlay, which is underneath. And and that's why the works are frameless, like the LEDs are frameless, and that's why, in this setting, in the Desert X setting, like I had to like literally defend the bushes, because the guys who are installing this, they're like concert guys, they're like they're rock concert guys. So it's kind of in out, like there's a certain kind of sort of energy to them, a certain speed to them, and I'm sort of begging them not to step on these little bushes, because like what you want is that like it feels like an undisturbed desert scene, and then there's this sort of uncanny virtual scene, and really like this installation was quite amazing for me, because we're outside Palm Springs, like we're off the highway to LA, and you have this audience like driving, between Palm Springs and LA, and it's a very diverse audience. You've got like rich people, which are kind of expected, but you've also got like people who are working in restaurants, people who are, what I mean, people on the road, that kind of thing. And a lot of them would just pull off the highway and come out to, and they were just like, "What is this?" And on the one hand, you can just say, this is like you take a little section of Times Square and kind of pull it down, put it on the landscape, which helps them understand what it is. Because they didn't really understand, like, in a sense, like, it feels a bit like an apparition, when you come across these things, because it's kind of like an image with no context or no frame. And then I suppose the next layer, and one of the things that made this installation very successful was the next layer is that like the flag is both familiar and also deeply unfamiliar, because it's produced from this intangible thing like smoke, which normally doesn't really behave like that, And one beautiful aspect about working within simulation is that you can work with intangible things like flames and smoke, again in a very sculptural way, And that's a whole process of trial and error, for us to make like a flag which is smoke-like and flag-like was, it was about 3 or 4 months of experimentation, and it we didn't get to that place very smoothly, we had to do a lot of invention to make that piece work. So for the public, like on that basis, they don't really recognize this thing. So it's kind of a couple of layers of kind of discomfort and sort of fascination, which I would suppose is the aspect about working in the public domain that is the most motivating for me. That like you get diverse audiences and they come to the work from this place of, in a way, kind of confusion, and it's interesting.
I don't mean to shift gears too much here, but I want to be sensitive of your time there, and I did want to ask you about your work just continues to evolve. Right. In terms of, and that's just the nature of working in a medium that's so closely tied to technology. And so, can you tell me about, I know that you have interest in AI and neural networks. Can you talk about the impact the emergence of that technology is having on your work?
Well, yeah, it's funny, actually. In a weird way, I almost disagree with you a little bit, because when I say we, I mean sort of myself as an artist in dialogue with collaborators and producers, over many years. We've kind of stuck to this very specific language of, let's say, world making. There's often like a subject, the camera orbits, it's set in a year. That's been kind of a consistent language for, nearly 20 years. And that's in the face of kind of just incredible developments within, let's say, game technology, graphic card technology, computer powers. I'd say if anything, the work has become more polished and realistic over time. Right. That's one of the big shifts in the language. But there's been kind of opportunities to kind of, let's say, blast out in different directions, which we haven't taken.
Right.
That said, and funny enough, getting back to the whole kind of light and space and Californian thing, I was invited by Los Angeles County Museum of Art to take part in their their art and tech program, which was revived by Michael Govan some years ago. And as part of that art and tech program, like as in the original art and tech program in the 60s, you're introduced to key tech players in California, one of whom, of course, is Google. And Google had been working on TensorFlow, which was their big kind of public-facing neural network. And so we were given particular kind of access to that. And I used that neural network within a kind of experimental work in which a leaf-covered figure is trained, given a kind of training set and produces a kind of perpetually unfolding dance. But in a weird way, like, you know, if you're working at that time, if you're working, like I was kind of like pushing against the core nature of AI, where like the training set, the scale of the training set is key, you know. So I was producing very small training sets using motion capture and dancers, and then I was expecting like the resulting work to have like the kind of complexity that the rest of the work had. So I a little bit stepped back from working with AI at that time. But, you know, very, very interestingly, you know, Midjourney, DALL-E, you know, they've all emerged since then. I mean, that was probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
And so AI, in terms of its manifestation in the public consciousness, it's now being driven by this very specific kind of like text-based AI output interfaces, right. You know, where you say like, you know, clown, you know, eating a carrot in the style of, you know, Degas. And boom, you know, this diffusion. Up comes this thing, and like it's like wow, what is going on, you know? And you know, it's illustrators and photographers and everybody's like, oh my Lord, you know, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to, you know, very, very close, I think, to, you know, painters looking at the emergence of photography, right. You know, and sort of like, you know, like let's say 19th century, you know, what are we going to do with this? Like, does this free us up? Does this, you know, does this exclude us? You know, there's a lot of people kind of, you know, I applied to be an early user of DALL-E, and I'm sort of sitting there going, you know, this is interesting. And how is this going to move? How is this going to influence, let's say, 3D? You know, because again, when I was with Art and Tech in LACMA, I was sitting with NVIDIA, and they were using AI to streamline real-time production. You know, because like real-time production is like it's so laborious. I mean, animation, right. You know, modeling. You know, like how long before we have a text prompt, like, you know, and you get a 3D model, you know, or a text prompt and you get an animation, you know, like, you know, dancer in the style of a robot, you know, and then the integration of all that, you know. So yeah, so like my kind of collision with AI was a couple of years ago through LACMA, and it sort of, you know, I got places with it, but like I'm just this tiny player in the kind of scale of those kind of, I keep coming back to the idea of the training set, but like that's a huge thing. And now, like, you know, the whole space, you know, open AI, and you know, sort of it's just kind of shifting like quicksand, you know.
Sure.
So I think we'll see. Next couple of years are going to be wild, I think, in that space.
On your horizon, what excites you? Where do you think your work is going? Are you excited more by the possibility of what NFTs are able to offer? Or is there something with technology that is emerging and evolving that is making you rethink you know, the site-specific work?
So I would say that, you know, I'm most excited to bring, you know, like, let's say 20 years of thinking about, you know, kind of 20 years of aesthetic development, 20 years of conceptual development, 20 years of kind of like, let's say, formal development into the space of what I would describe as NFTs and world making, simultaneously acknowledging that, you know, artists who've been, let's say, been working within the contemporary art world digitally for decades, you know, we're here, you know, we're speaking, we're kind of were present. But weirdly, the contemporary art was getting more conservative, not less conservative. It's becoming more analog. It's becoming more geographic. It's becoming less open to like experimentation, you know? And there's this kind of weird sort of stultifying into kind of like, let's say, kind of late conceptualism meets art povera, let's just say. Mm-hmm. And, you know, my role or my kind of presence in that world just kind of was sort of shrinking. You know, I'd sort of go to, you know, different kind of settings, like even biennales, frankly. And I was like, you know, this could have happened like 50 years ago, this biennale. I mean, and there's some biennales running right now, which could have happened 50 years ago. Like they're running this summer, you know, it's like, it's kind of amazing how, I would say how kind of conservative in medium terms, a lot of the contemporary art biennales are right now.
Got it.
So, you know, out of nowhere, for me anyway, you know, this NFT space like spun into view, you know, which kind of delivers two things simultaneously. Like it delivers a radical distribution model because, you know, it's not like geographic analog, come here, buy this, leave again, put it in a crate. It's kind of digital people collecting digital things, you know, and passionately connecting digital things, you know, and it's early days of that. So, you know, it's a kind of distribution model. And it's also like an exhibition space, you know, where like who was really looking at web art like 3 years ago? You know, like it was very niche, you know. You know, I certainly wasn't like making work for the web, you know, I was making work for the world, you know, but the world is now looking at, and like somehow that weird kind of triangular relationship between kind of art, money, and society, which is kind of like a whole thing in itself, you know, which is kind of the eternal kind of like kind of conflict of, you know, like there's an internal conflict within that. And like painting's been in the midst of it forever. But suddenly within that nexus of art, money, and society, you know, people are paying attention to websites showing digital art. And it's just like night and day in terms of how digital artists can work, you know, and how they can survive and how they can thrive and how they can speak and, you know, etc. So I would say that, you know, there's a lot of problematics within the NFT space. There's a lot of opportunities. But for me, it is the absolute core focus for me right now. And again, to reiterate, you know, to bring like just many, many years of thought and development within simulation on the one hand, but also within exhibition on the other, you know, and to bring them, you know, and try and bring them into that space and to, you know, talk to the wider communities there. And, you know, even, you know, like when I first looked into NFTs like a year and a half ago, you know, it was a very two-dimensional space, very linear two-dimensional space, you know, MP4s and such things. The emergence of like art blocks, you know, kind of threw up this generative element, which is kind of code-based and, you know, fundamentally artistic in a way that other parts of the NFT world kind of are less so. And I really feel that like there's just this incredibly exciting possibility to think about space and time in that space next, you know, so that's what I'm going to do.
Well, John, I really appreciate your time today, and it's really been a joy talking to you about your work that's so thoughtful and is I just feel is, you know, taking advantage of the changing technological landscape, but also is just kind of challenging people to think about the world around them and these structures of power, right? And so I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.